Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Jeremy Corbyn's outlined a significant shift in Labour's Brexit policy by advocating that the UK form a customs union with the EU if his party wins power. It puts Labour at odds with the Prime Minister's current position, which is for the UK to leave both the customs union and the single market when the country leaves the EU. Mr Corbyn also criticised the Conservatives, saying that they had no plan for the economy and no plan for Brexit.
During the transition period, which was proposed by Labour in the first place, Labour would seek to remain in a customs union with the EU and within the single market. That means we would abide by the existing rules of both during transition. Labour would not countenance a deal that left Britain as a passive recipient of rules decided elsewhere by others that would mean ending up as a mere rule taker. In contrast, the Conservative government has moved from saying it wanted trade with the EU after Brexit to be tariff-free to saying it wants it to be as tariff-free as possible, quite significant change. In which sectors of the economy and industry does the government think would be acceptable for there to be tariffs? They should let us know. Like with so much else, they haven't spelled that out 20 months after the referendum. Labour respects the result of the referendum and Britain is leaving the EU, but we will not support any Tory deal that would do lasting damage to jobs, rights and living standards.
So what exactly is a customs union? Well, a customs union is a group of two or more countries that have agreed to charge the same import duties as each other and usually allow free trade between themselves, reducing administrative and financial trade barriers such as customs checks and charges. The EU is the biggest customs union in the world in terms of economic output of all its members. All trade and goods between EU countries must be free from customs duties, and member states must apply a common customs tariff for good imported from outside of the EU. The only country outside the EU that has a customs union with it is Turkey. It's not a member, but does enjoy some benefits of trading within the customs union. But the deal's been criticised as limiting, with Turkey being restricted in developing trade policies and other states and having to open its markets to any country the EU strikes an agreement with. All EU states are members of the European Economic Area, the EEA, but it also includes non-EU states such as Iceland, Liechtenstein and Norway. Those non-EU countries have access to the single market, allowing them to trade goods with the EU states without customs fees, except for food and drink, including fishing and agricultural products. In return, they have to implement all the EU's laws relating to the internal market, including free movement of workers, without having a say over those rules. And there's also the single market to throw into the mix, like a customs union. The single market is also a free trade area, but instead of just focusing on trading goods, it allows for the free movement of workers, investments and services. Being a member of the single market normally means having to pay the EU money every year and accepting the laws of the European Court of Justice, which would cross a few red lines for Brexiteers. Well, our political editor Faisal Islam is in Coventry, where Mr Corbyn made this speech. And Faisal, there has been a lot of criticism of Labour over the last few months for not having a clear strategy, a clear policy on Brexit. Jeremy Corbyn hopes to put those to rest today.
Yeah, on this issue of a customs union, and it was something that was being considered by some members of the cabinet. Certainly when I asked the Prime Minister and Liam Fox in China about specifically a customs union, at that point, just a few weeks ago, they wouldn't rule it out, and for good reason, because actually in their own legislation, in the customs bill and the trade bill, there is a specific reference to the possibility of fast-track powers for creating a customs union, and the EU is mentioned in the notes. So, I mean, what is going on? The government saying, no, 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 we don't want this. What it boils down to is this. It's about the ability to do fully independent trade deals. What Labour is saying is that they prioritise the existing relationship with Europe, which is, when you take exports and imports, more than half of our trade. No coincidence that Jeremy Corbyn chose here in Coventry, which was on the one hand 56% voting leave at the referendum, but is also the historic home of the British automotive industry. And that is an industry that has unapologetically demanded that Britain stays in the customs union because its industry relies on these very quick turnaround, fast movements of parts from all around Europe, just-in-time delivery. Jeremy Corbyn mentioning those types of factories and the need for continuous frictionless trade. He's basically come down on the view that the only real way to guarantee that into the future, and crucially to guarantee that there won't be a hard border, is to reform a form of customs union. But it does leave him open to those Labour Leave voters who may have thought the whole point of Brexit was to open up new independent trade deals with the US and China. My sense, though, is that that was always rather hopeful of anybody assessing Jeremy Corbyn. He's never been one for these free trade deals, certainly not with the likes of Donald Trump's America. So it's no downside from his perspective. The problem, though, is in terms of how much say would the United Kingdom have over the trade deals done by the European Union. His argument, Keir Starmer's argument, is that because the United Kingdom is so big, it could extract out of the European Union a commitment for co-determining, for having a big say on those trade deals going forward. We've heard nothing back from Brussels that they'd be willing to do that. There's a bit of cake and eat it in that. But maybe they know something that we don't about Europe's negotiation. On the single market, though, not enough for some Labour kind of Remainers, single marketers. A bit sceptical about elements of the single market as regards state aid rules, as regards the rules that enable agency workers to come in. He's saying he wants reform of that. Others will also argue that you can't just stay part of the customs union on its own. In order to make it function and for trade to be frictionless in goods, you also need to be part of some elements of the single market. And he did mention remaining part of some of the regulatory agencies, such as the Aviation Agency and the Chemicals Agency. So I think basically Jeremy Corbyn feels that he doesn't have the same red lines as Theresa May and the Conservatives, doesn't have the same issue around trying to do these buccaneering free trade deals, and he thinks that Labour Leave voters in places like this, Coventry, they are less bothered about that type of stuff. He feels he can sell a form of Brexit that guarantees current economic advantages of Europe, but then just kind of get on with it without having to do these external trade deals. The government will argue, well, hang on a minute, what's the point of Barry Gardiner being Shadow Trade Secretary when he won't have trade deals to negotiate? And they are criticising what they see as a betrayal of the Labour manifesto that did have some promises on international trade. Labour, though, feel that they've opened up blue water now and can take advantage of this difference in policy with the government.
OK, Faisal, thanks very much for that. Let's just bring you a bit of breaking news that we're getting from Leicestershire Police. This is about the explosion in the fire in the building in Leicester last night. We know that 4 people were confirmed dead. That number has now gone up to 5. They've found a 5th body. They say, sadly, the number of people found dead in the collapsed building now has risen to 5. 5 others are still in hospital. One of those is in a critical condition. So 10 victims so far, 5 injured and 5 now dead. They are concerned also, the police, that they believe that there may be people who've not yet been accounted for, and the rescue efforts are continuing in order to try to locate any further casualties. Well, back to Brexit, and also today the Cabinet Office Minister David Lidington's been setting out how the government's Brexit plan will affect the devolved governments of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Sky's political correspondent Jason Farrell was there at Mr Lidington's speech, and words of reassurance, Jason.
Yeah, well, Mr Lidington's speech is number 4 of 6 speeches. We're going to hear from Liam Fox tomorrow and then Theresa May at the end of the week. And this was all about devolution. He says he has a considerable offer for the devolved governments, effectively saying that the majority of powers from Brussels will go back to Cardiff, Edinburgh and Belfast and not to Whitehall. Let's have a listen to what he had to say.
So our proposal is to amend the bill before Parliament to make clear that while frameworks are being agreed, the presumption would now be that powers returning from the EU should sit at a devolved level. Westminster would only be involved where, to protect the UK common market or to meet our international obligations, we needed a pause, and I stress a pause, to give the governments time to design and put in place a UK-wide framework.
Well, the governments of Scotland and Wales do have some issues with this. They wonder what these frameworks will be and who will have the power over the frameworks. David Lidington used the example of packaging on boxes, saying when those rules come back from Europe, they don't want 4 different rules from 4 different governments. However, the Scottish government I've been talking to say that actually agricultural powers, for example, if it was packaging on agricultural products, do lie with Scotland. So any framework that is set up to preserve the UK market might potentially lead to a power grab by Westminster. So they're not entirely happy with what they've heard from David Lidington today.
And thanks very much. Now, Jeremy Corbyn has set up a high-stakes showdown with Theresa May by backing a customs union to ensure tariff-free trade after Brexit. Puts Labour at odds with the Prime Minister's current position for the UK to leave both the customs union and the single market when the country leaves the EU. Mr Corbyn also criticised the Conservatives, saying they had no plan for the economy and no plan for Brexit.
During the transition period, which was proposed by Labour in the first place, Labour would seek to remain in a customs union with the EU and within the single market. That means we would abide by the existing rules of both during transition. Labour would not countenance a deal that left Britain as a passive recipient of rules decided elsewhere by others that would mean ending up as a mere rule taker. In contrast, the Conservative government has moved from saying it wanted trade with the EU after Brexit to be tariff-free to saying it wants it to be as tariff-free as possible, quite significant change. In which sectors of the economy and industry does the government think would be acceptable for there to be tariffs? They should let us know. Like with so much else, they haven't spelled that out 20 months after the referendum. Labour respects the result of the referendum and Britain is leaving the EU, but we will not support any Tory deal that would do lasting damage to jobs, rights and living standards.
Let's bring in our chief political correspondent, John Craig, who's standing by for us in Westminster. Hello to you, John. Now, the latest that I was reading over the weekend was from former advisor to Theresa May, who said when we voted in the referendum, we were voting for leaving the customs union anyway. So the leader of the opposition at odds with that.
That has been the response too from senior Conservatives. For example, Liam Fox has accused him of a cynical attempt to try and frustrate the Brexit process and play politics with our country's future. Now, Mr Corbyn is betraying millions of Labour voters, according to Mr Liam Fox. Boris Johnson says it's a cynical and deluded move intended to win a Commons vote rather than do what's best for the country. Now, that Commons vote that Boris Johnson is referring to is an amendment that's been tabled by some Conservative MPs. You know who they are. It's Anna Soubry, Ken Clarke, Stephen Hammond. It's the same group that rebelled just before Christmas. Keir Starmer was saying yesterday that Labour have tabled very similar amendments, but the Labour Party is probably going to, assuming the Speaker selects the Tory rebel amendment, they are going to support that. And yes, there's no doubt that the tactics of Mr Corbyn and his closest ally and chief lieutenant, if you like, John McDonnell, are to try and defeat the government in Parliament because they want a general election. I just bumped into John McDonnell over in Parliament. He said that Mr Corbyn's speech was finely balanced. Well, that's pretty fair because, of course, he hasn't gone as far as some Remainers would like. For example, it's been welcomed by the pro-Remain Labour MPs who acknowledge that he's made quite a shift. But Nicola Sturgeon, the SNP leader and Scottish First Minister, has said it still sounds very similar to the have cake and eat approach of the PM. That betrayal charge is also being made by the small band of Labour Eurosceptics like Frank Field and Kate Hoey as well.
OK, for now, thank you.
Other news, Jeremy Corbyn has set up a high-stakes showdown with Theresa May by backing a customs union to ensure tariff-free trade after Brexit. Puts Labour at odds with the Prime Minister's current position for the UK to leave both the customs union and the single market when the country leaves the EU. Speaking to our political editor, Faisal Islam, Mr Corbyn also criticised the Conservatives, saying they had no plan for the economy and no plan for Brexit.
What's changed in your view on the European Union?
What we've done is set out the need to have an effective trading relationship with Europe and the ability for an incoming Labour government to invest in the left-behind communities and be able to intervene in our economy and to take certain industries into public ownership, which we set out in our general election manifesto.
But in places like Coventry, which majority voted Leave, do you really think that they voted for continued control of trade policy from Europe?
The vast majority of the British motor industry trades with Europe or imports parts from Europe, and as I explained in my speech, a car crosses the channel several times without actually being used as a car. It's part of the construction process. And so what they voted for was to leave the EU, but I think what we've tried to set out today is accept the result of the referendum, recognise that there are competition rules in the European Union that are wrong, in my view. There are state aid rules that I think are inadequate and wrong also, and I think what we need is a trade relationship with Europe that also allows us to develop our own economy. But the difference between us and the Tories is 62 Tory MPs write to Daily Telegraph, and what do they want? Tearing up workers' rights and conditions, tearing up protections, tearing up regulation. We're not going down that road.
No, but in terms of trade deals, there are many people who voted for an independent trade policy. I mean, you might as well fire Barry Gardiner. He doesn't have a job to do in terms of negotiating trade deals.
He's got a fantastic job to do, and he does it very well. He's, for example, was at the WTO recently, making the case there for fairer trade relations with the rest of the world. We would obviously have to trade with Europe, but we'd also want to have a say in that relationship and a say in our trade relations with the rest of the world. But the reality, and it is a real issue, is that half of our trade is with the European Union. We cannot walk away and lose all those jobs here in Coventry or indeed anywhere else.
But this is classic. I mean, it's your version of it, but it's classic cake and eat it, isn't it? The idea that you will be in a customs union and yet still have a say and a veto over European trade policies.
We're leaving the European Union, for sure, that's clear.
Yeah.
We have to maintain a trade relationship with Europe, that is clear. We have a right to develop our economy in the way that we want rather than the way the Tories are doing it. We think that what we've set out here is the right approach for the future. We are, after all, the fifth biggest economy in the world. We are quite an important trading partner of a lot of countries.
Well, let's get more reaction to Labour's revised policy on Brexit following that speech by Jeremy Corbyn this morning. Joining us from Westminster, the Lib Dem leader, Sir Vince Cable. Nice to see you, Sir Vince. Jeremy Corbyn's comments this morning then putting a certain amount of clear water between them and the Conservatives. He says he will be part of a customs union. The Conservatives say they won't be in a customs union. What about the Lib Dems?
Well, we believe we should be in the customs union. I mean, we recognise that Jeremy Corbyn's speech is a small step, and it's only a small step, but it's in the direction of sanity and to be welcome to that extent. But I think one shouldn't exaggerate. He's still splitting hairs and talking about a customs union rather than the customs union we're already part of, and which protects the interests of the car industry and the other supply chain industries that he was talking about, and keeps open the Irish border. But on the sort of bigger issues really around the single market, he's in exactly the same position as Theresa May and the Conservative government. I mean, he's arguing for this, have cake and eat it approach. You could call it have cake and eat it plus, plus, plus. He wants to save different things. He wants to keep Britain's freedom to intervene more heavily in industry and employ state aids and subsidies. If he wanted a socialist government, the motives are different, but the consequences are exactly the same.
In terms of the single market, though, my understanding is that he said he would wish to stay in that, especially for the transition period. If you stay in the single market and if you stay in a customs union, it's not Brexit, is it? It's not what people voted for.
Well, I think staying in a customs union could be treated as a separate issue. There is an argument, if you believe in Brexit, of having it and keeping in the customs union. I don't see any fundamental problem with that. The single market is somewhat more fundamental. My understanding is that Jeremy Corbyn isn't in favour of staying in the single market because he's set a whole set of conditions in relation to Britain's freedom to nationalise and introduce a planned socialist economy, which are actually not compatible with European Union rules. So I don't think he's in that position at all. There is a sort of broad acceptance, even in the government, that there needs to be a period of transition, but the key issue is what happens at the end of the transition. Is it just a question of kicking the can down the road and making up your mind what you do at the end of it, or is it having a clearly defined objection? And in this sense, Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn are in exactly the same position.
Others will argue, though, that he's giving an opportunity for some Conservatives who might wish to stop the government to move more towards his way of thinking. And if you're saying it is the right step, a small step in the right direction, could you see yourself backing Labour amendments to Brexit? Could you see yourself siding with Labour and perhaps some Conservatives to block the government?
Well, as I understand it, it isn't a Labour amendment. There are some Conservatives who have come forward with proposals to stay within the customs union. I very much welcome that. I believe the point of Jeremy Corbyn's intervention is to prepare the Labour Party to support those Conservative rebels, and we will do that. I mean, we don't think it's an ideal outcome, but it's certainly progress.
OK, Vince Cable.
Thank you.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, thank you.
Thank you.
And again, you are watching the Sky News. We want to talk to you in more detail in just a few minutes' time about what's happening as far as Brexit is concerned. The decision has gone down. We've heard from Labour. They are saying that as far, certainly from Jeremy Corbyn, he has been saying that as far as Labour is concerned, he wants the government and the UK to be part of any sort of customs union. Now, we've heard from the Prime Minister, and she said, we're not having that. So that has resulted in a bit of a standoff. Certainly, the Prime Minister needs the Labour votes in the House of Commons when it comes to any Brexit negotiations because of the rebel Tory MP. She only really has those DUP votes, doesn't it, that pushes her over the top when it comes to any major votes. So let's find out what's going to happen as far as that standoff is concerned. Sally Lockwood can tell us. She is in Burnley. Hello to you, Sally. So a bit of a standoff. You're in a Labour heartland. How are they feeling where you are?
Yeah, that's right, Kay. Labour have a majority of more than 6,000 here, and they voted overwhelmingly out in the EU referendum. 66.6% of people here supporting the Leave vote. So nearly 2 years on from that referendum, what do people make of it? How do they think it's going? And crucially today, what do they make of Jeremy Corbyn's vision for a softer Brexit? Well, we've been speaking to people here in Burnley Town Centre today, and here's a flavour of what they had to say.
Well, it's like it's up and then it's down, and it's like a jigsaw puzzle. They're not fitting together. One's got one piece and one's got the other piece.
Yeah.
So they're in between one another.
There won't be much for any of the young people, unless they do really well, and even at that you can't guarantee.
I think Labour's. I think he's doing right. I think, you know, he's going his own way about it, and I don't think the Prime Minister's that good, to be honest.
You can probably see it's very quiet behind me here in the town centre, and it's been like that for much of the day. Very, very few people out shopping here. And the main concern from the people that I've spoken to is the lack of jobs. People want to see more jobs up here, and they want more money in their pockets. Do they think that Brexit's the answer? Well, they certainly don't think that it isn't. But the overriding feeling that I've experienced here today, speaking to people, is that there certainly feels a big detachment up here in Burnley from the negotiations that are happening down in Westminster.
OK, thank you. Joined by Shadow Brexit Minister Paul Blomfield. Hello to you, Paul. Thanks for joining us on Sky News this afternoon. What's your leader up to?
Well, we've been trying to take a lead at every crucial stage in the negotiations. So last summer, when there was a concern about the cliff edge when we leave in March 2019, we called for transitional arrangements, and the government followed on and accepted that. Today, the negotiations looking at the next stage, how we cement a positive future economic relationship which can address the concerns that you were hearing from Burnley about jobs and the economy and people's livelihoods. And for us, that means having a comprehensive customs union with the European Union. It's not just us saying that. We are taking up the call of the CBI and the IOD, representing business and indeed of the trade union movement.
But that's not what the referendum said, according to a former senior advisor to the Prime Minister, suggesting that the referendum suggested if we were coming out of the European Union, we were also coming out of the customs union, and that's what we voted for.
Well, I think anybody that went into the polling station for the vote on our future relationship with the European Union won't remember the customs union being on the ballot paper. I spoke to hundreds and hundreds of people during the debate. Nobody mentioned the customs union to me. People voted to leave the European Union, and that's what we're doing. But they didn't vote for a job-destroying, livelihood-damaging Brexit. And what we're trying to ensure is that we leave on the best possible terms. And as both sides of business and industry have said, that means staying within a customs union.
OK, so we should have another referendum on what we agree to before we leave. Is that what we should do?
That's not what we're saying at all. What we're saying is a vote was taken to leave the European Union. That's something that Parliament has respected, and the negotiations have started. But we have this paralysis at the moment because the government can't start the negotiations because it can't agree with itself which way to go, and that's causing enormous frustrations. We're 20 months on from the key vote. We're still no clearer on what the government wants. So we're trying to provide some clarity. We're saying this sort of arrangement within a customs union would mean that we could successfully maintain our economic relationship with the European Union while leaving in accordance with the decision that was taken in the referendum.
As a country, we should be looking more united. We should be giving the impression of being more united to our friends across the Channel. They're poking fun at us on things like social media, on Twitter, because they can see that we're a divided nation and they basically are going to be able to get whatever they want from us because we can't have a united front.
Well, I think they're poking fun at what is a extraordinarily divided government, and it is a real tragedy. At this critical time in our country's history, we are negotiating the most important settlement, probably since the Second World War, and we have a government which is split absolutely down the middle. And no wonder the European Union are aghast at the situation. They want to strike a deal, they want to negotiate, but as they said time and again, we just want to know what Britain wants. And this Conservative government is incapable of telling them. OK, so what do you hope to have achieved from what we've heard from the leader of the opposition today? What would be a good outcome? Well, I think there's an overwhelming majority. We've heard it from business and industry and from the trade unions, and it exists in the Houses of Parliament too, for a sensible approach to Brexit, something that means we leave the European Union, but we don't destroy our economy in the process, as some of the extremists within the Conservative Party are happy to do. That means maintaining a customs union, so we have frictionless trade, and it means a close alignment with the single market. In that way, as the government's own economic analysis shows, we can do the best for our economy. The further we deviate, the further we part, the deeper the rupture, the government's analysis suggests, the more the damage to our economy and to people's jobs and livelihoods. And that's what we mustn't have. Good to talk to you. Thank you.
Jeremy Corbyn has set out Labour's vision for Brexit, saying the UK should remain in an EU customs union, but only if the British can have a say in negotiating the bloc's future trade deals. He said it would allow free-flowing trade and prevent a hard border in Northern Ireland. The current customs union ensures that some goods coming into the EU have the same tariffs, but international trade deals are negotiated by the EU. Labour's announcement marks a clear difference in policy with the government, which says the UK will come out of the customs union. Our political editor, Laura Koonsberg, has more.
Bit by bit, piece by piece. A clearer view on Brexit if Jeremy Corbyn was in charge. Labour wants to keep our customs deal with the EU essentially the same for good.
So Labour would seek to negotiate a new, comprehensive UK-EU customs union, to ensure there are no tariffs with Europe, and to help avoid any need whatsoever for a hard border in Northern Ireland.
But listen very carefully. There's a big if in there.
The option of a new UK customs union with the EU would need to ensure that the UK has a say in future trade deals. A new customs arrangement would depend on Britain being able to negotiate agreement for new trade deals in our national interest.
Other countries with similar kinds of deals have very little control.
We would have to have a meaningful say in how those negotiations went and what the agreement was, so we would not end up as simply passive rule takers.
But what if they say no to your proposal, as is very likely given what the European Union has said?
Listen, we would want to make sure, and would make sure, that Britain had a say in our trade relations.
But
We're
how?
not by negotiation. Negotiations require an understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of both sides, by the degree of manufacturing industry, of agriculture, of food industries that operate on both sides of the channel, and also, as I say, we're not going to undercut the whole of Europe.
But what is your plan B?
The plan B is to continue negotiating in order to achieve plan A.
Whether it's A or B, it seemingly tilts to a softer Brexit, even though most Labour seats in Coventry and around the country voted to leave. But some Brexit-backing Labour MPs question whether it's real.
There's no way they're going to agree that we would have our own customs union, that we stick our nose into any trade agreements they want to do, and that Jeremy's kept faith with his long-term objective that we must be free to negotiate our own trade agreements.
For many voters, there's been enough dancing around the details.
A clean break, a total clean break, yeah.
Why do you say that?
Because, like, let's get, Great Britain, back to Great Britain and how it used to be.
Why say we should stay as close as possible? I don't think we should stay as close as possible, because I don't think it's a good idea to be in the EU. It's not beneficial to everybody, really.
I could speak to these two guys now and they would tell me one thing and the people behind them would tell... Everybody's views are so mixed up, I think. We just want an end to it now, I think.
If a Labour voter said to you, I back Brexit, and I did not think that would mean still having a trading relationship with the European Union, they wanted something more dramatic, a more dramatic break, what would you say to them?
I would say to them, think this thing through. We have a lot of jobs that are dependent on sails back and forth across the North Sea or across the Channel, and we have to ensure those jobs.
This isn't Jeremy Corbyn tearing up Labour's plans for Brexit. It's more a careful step along the way, trying to contain the tensions inside his own party, those on both sides of the argument, and the many Labour voters who backed Brexit in 2016. It does also, though, politically conveniently draw a clear difference between the Labour position and the Conservatives' plans.
Lovely, thank you. You're right. Thanks a lot. Thanks for coming, guys.
Because not just his fans, but some Remain-tending Tory MPs want to keep our customs links too. Labour's firmer position and Parliament could cause trouble for number 10. Laura Kunzberg, BBC News, Coventry.
So what difference could it make to trade if Britain stayed in a permanent customs union with the EU? Well, our reality check correspondent Chris Morris is here to explain all. Chris.
Thanks, Fiona. Yes, being in a customs union with the EU after Brexit would mean there would still be a common external tariff, in effect the same tax, on goods being brought in from elsewhere in the world. But it would also mean, like now, that there would be no tariffs for goods crossing borders between the UK and the EU.
That's important for companies based in the UK which operate complex manufacturing processes across Europe. This is the BMW factory in Oxford, mentioned by Mr Corbyn, where they make the Mini. Its components cross EU borders multiple times.
A crankshaft cast in France crosses to a plant in Warwickshire to be finished. It then goes back to Austria to be built into an engine, which then comes back to Oxford to be put in a completed car. Half the cars built in Oxford are then exported back to the EU, and it's all tariff-free. But the government argues that the problem with a customs union is that you can't negotiate your own trade deals around the world, a key part of taking back control. It's true that you are constrained. You can't alter tariffs on goods. But you can still do deals on services and on harmonising regulations with other countries. Now, Labour says it would still want to be involved alongside the EU in negotiating any trade deals in the national interest. So is it trying to have its cake and eat it? Business leaders are still looking for a little more clarity.
Being in a customs union is a hassle-free solution for businesses, but there are different types of customs union, and what we heard from Jeremy Corbyn today is, it's not all of the details. We still need to hear more before businesses know.
It's also worth remembering that being in a customs union wouldn't entirely solve the problem of maintaining an invisible border in Ireland. Still, a big day for Labour's position on Brexit. But whatever policy emerges in London, all of it still needs to be negotiated with the other 27 EU countries. And all of them have opinions of their own. Fiona.
Chris, thank you.
The Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has told ITV News there should be a general election, not a second EU referendum, if MPs reject a Brexit deal. It came as he signalled a change in Labour policy, calling for Britain to negotiate a new customs union with Europe. Such a deal could ensure tariff-free trade and solve the problem of the Irish border. But it could also cause problems for Theresa May's Brexit plans. Mr Corbyn spoke to our political editor, Robert Peston.
The most famous cap in British politics arrives in Coventry to announce an important shift in his party's approach to Brexit. Like the red tie he hurriedly pinned to his neck, his announcement firmly differentiates his party from the government of Theresa May.
Labour would seek to negotiate a new, comprehensive UK-EU customs union to ensure there are no tariffs with Europe and to help avoid any need whatsoever for a hard border in Northern Ireland.
His point was that with membership of a customs union, there'd be no need for customs checks at the UK's borders anywhere, including on the highly sensitive border of Northern Ireland and the Republic. But there'd be a price.
Britain wouldn't be able to negotiate trade deals with the likes of China or India or the US. So what's the point of leaving the European Union?
Our view is that half of British trade is with the European Union. Manufacturing jobs are very important. We're here in Coventry, which is a centre of car industry, and sales in Europe are very important, as well as imports from Europe. And so what we're keen to do is maintain that trade relationship. But we're not going to reduce ourselves to a position where we have no influence over any rules.
What you want is an arrangement whereby the rest of the European Union would give Britain an influence, but they don't give Turkey any influence over their trade policy, so why should they give us any influence?
There is a huge amount of trade across the Channel. Manufacturing industry is very interdependent. We are the 5th biggest economy in the world. I think we're in a position to negotiate a reasonable relationship.
You're in favour, obviously, of Parliament having a meaningful vote on the final deal. If Theresa May were defeated in that vote on a final deal, surely at that point the British people should have another vote on that deal itself, on whether we stay or leave the EU.
Well, if the government has been fundamentally defeated, then it has two choices. One is to go back and negotiate something different, or the other one is to resign.
What may also worry the Prime Minister is that this very left-wing Labour Party won praise from business.
It's really encouraging that Labour have heeded the CBI and many thousands of businesses' call for the importance of a really well-negotiated customs union.
But the International Trade Secretary was less impressed.
Today they've just betrayed millions of voters who voted to take control back in the European referendum, and Labour has handed the ball straight back to Brussels.
But some Tory MPs are on this closer to Labour than to their own Prime Minister.
And the question then is, which is likely to be the better for us? I think the evidence is absolutely overwhelming that it will be to be able to continue the frictionless trade with our European Union partners and not these free trade agreements elsewhere, however interesting and desirable they might be.
A day's work for Jeremy Corbyn that is in large measure about inflicting humiliation on Theresa May. Robert Peston, ITV News.
Now, here in Britain, Jeremy Corbyn has confirmed Labour's new policy on Brexit.
In a speech in Coventry, he said a Labour government would negotiate a new customs union between Britain and the European Union. But he said a condition of such a new tariff-free customs arrangement would be that Britain has a say in future trade deals struck by the EU. The policy creates a clear division between Labour and the Conservatives on Brexit, but how might Brexit-supporting Labour voters react to the new proposal? Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, went to Coventry to find out.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Pressure from shadow cabinet members and trade union leaders helped to make this moment possible. The chance to inflict a critical defeat on the government in the Commons made it unmissable. After months of tiptoeing towards a policy of supporting joining the EU in a customs union, Jeremy Corbyn today declared Labour had got there.
Labour would seek to negotiate a new, comprehensive UK-EU customs union to ensure there are no tariffs with Europe and to help avoid any need whatsoever for a hard border in Northern Ireland. But we're also clear that the option of a new UK customs union with the EU would need to ensure that the UK has a say in future trade deals.
Jeremy Corbyn said Britain was bound to get more from a free trade deal negotiated alongside the EU than by going it alone, seeking a free trade deal with the US or China. But would the EU give a non-member any real say in a trade negotiation?
You might just have a right to be heard, not a right to a vote or a veto on any trade agreements that the EU might have. Could you live with that?
What we're going to achieve is our right to be able to negotiate and consult at the same time with the European Union on the sort of trade agreements that we make, and also to influence them on the sort of trade deals that are made with the rest of the world, for example.
The man credited with shifting Labour to a new position says we can't know yet what the EU will actually sign up to.
Of course we'd want a say in what those trade deals are, what they look like. It'd be very sensitive issues.
Is that a
for vote?
Us. A veto?
But we'd negotiate it, but of course we want a proper say. Now, what
not
that
a vote
is,
or a veto.
what I'm not spelling it out because we're going to have to negotiate it. But what we're really doing is answering the question, do you want to stay close to the EU or do you want to be distant? And distant has huge economic risks.
But close to the EU is a stance that could have political risks in areas like Coventry, alienating some pro-Leave Labour support.
Many Labour MPs who represent strong pro-Brexit areas worry that any softening of Labour's line on Brexit could work well in London constituencies like Keir Starmer's and Jeremy Corbyn's, but could go down very badly indeed in seats like this.
Well, they were right on their manifesto for the last election, but they're chopping and changing that now, fiddling around.
You think they're going a bit soft on Brexit?
Yes.
Too soft for you?
Yes, because the will of the people has to be implemented.
Could it affect the way you vote if Labour are doing this sort of deal?
I would vote Labour then, and I've voted Labour all my life.
But you wouldn't vote for them if they did this?
No, not if they say they're still,
if they come to a customs
we're in,
agreement.
but we're out. We're neither in nor out.
I always vote for Labour.
And you're glad to hear them saying that their version of Brexit might be a bit closer to the EU?
Yes, because I think we should be. United we stand, divided we fall.
Makes you more inclined to vote, even more inclined to vote Labour?
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
We're fighting.
The Labour leadership is hoping that its new position will unite enough opposition MPs and Tory rebels to defeat the government in a Commons vote expected this spring.
You pointed out it's been 20 months since the referendum, and you say the Tories have been playing politics. Why have you suddenly now come round to the idea of a customs agreement? Some people might think you've got a political game on your mind.
We thought it would be helpful if, as the second stage of negotiation beginning, we set out our views here today, which is exactly what we're doing. And thank you for coming along.
The Foreign Secretary said Jeremy Corbyn's approach would make Britain a colony of the EU.
Thanks for coming, guys.
But some ministers sniffed danger at the sight of a radical Labour leader winning plaudits from business and employers' organisations, making friends and maybe advancing his wider cause. Gary Gibbon, Channel 4 News, Coventry.
So what does Labour's conversion to a post-Brexit customs union mean for the UK's businesses? Our business editor Siobhan Kennedy has been speaking to the boss of one of Britain's biggest paper packaging and recycling firms, worth £5 billion, which runs factories here and on the continent.
DS Smith makes the boxes that carry 80% of Amazon's goods around the UK and Europe. It's a FTSE 100 packaging firm which trades across 27 European countries and makes 9 billion boxes a year. But like all big business, the prospect of Brexit has the boss nervous.
We need to understand what the trading relationship between the UK and Europe is going to be. And I'll be honest, we've been waiting for 18 months. And the longer we go, it means the less investment there's been. And that's a shame for all of us who live here.
They don't just make boxes, they recycle them too. In fact, Mr. Roberts has ploughed £4 billion into Europe in the past 5 years, but he's specifically holding off here until there's more clarity. Something Labour attempted to inject today with its plan to stay in a customs union.
What do you make of the announcement from Jeremy Corbyn today?
It's always good news. We're talking about the free flow of goods, about trade. That's always good news. Being part of this huge market has really benefited our UK staff, the thousands of people we employ here. And when we talk about trade deals with other countries such as China, etc., I mean, we mustn't forget they're a long way away, and transportation costs become very important, and the timing as well. Whereas our proximity to France from our UK suddenly doubles the size of our market.
The government has made clear it will not remain in the customs union or single market once we're outside the EU. But Jeremy Corbyn has said Labour does want Britain to remain in a customs union. That would mean continuing to enjoy free trade with the EU, as well as the benefits of deals negotiated by the EU with the rest of the world, though Mr Corbyn says he'd want a seat at the negotiating table. There's no guarantee he'd have any steer on policy, of course, and nor would there be common regulations between the UK and the EU, as Mr Corbyn is clear Britain will leave the single market.
From a business perspective, the announcement and particularly the comment on a future customs union with the EU feels much more politically motivated than taking into account business perspectives. Both Labour and government seem to be negotiating with each other, whereas what they really need to be doing is realistically outlining what is possible to negotiate with Brussels.
While businesses like this one are of course happy to hear politicians spell out the benefits of the customs union, they're also aware that on some level it is Labour trying to score political points ahead of Theresa May's Brexit speech on Friday. The truth is, whether it's Labour or the Tories, for a business like this, it's not the political packaging around the customs union, but what's inside the final product that counts. Siobhan Kennedy, Channel 4 News in Uxbridge.
Well, we're joined by Labour's international trade spokesman, Barry Gardiner. Barry Gardiner, you and Jeremy Corbyn have been implacable opponents of EU membership for years. And suddenly you have, yes, you voted out, you voted no, you voted leave in the referendum. No. Jeremy Corbyn has never extolled the values of the EU. This is a strictly political move to try and tempt Conservative rebels.
Well, look, that's simply wrong, John. I have campaigned for us to stay in the European Union. I did that at the referendum. I voted to stay in the referendum in the European Union. But what I also did was I had to respect the referendum vote. And we have, I think in the Labour Party, we have really a historic responsibility because, as you well know, 64% of people who say they're Labour voters voted to remain. 64% of Labour constituencies voted to leave. It's our responsibility to try and bring that 52 and that 48% back together again.
But you're politician enough to know that at the time of the vote, the number of people, you, me, everyone else, who knew all there was to know about the European Union and the trading system was pretty small. And yet you're really saying, oh, well, they knew exactly what they were doing.
No. Look, today's announcement by Jeremy and the speech that Jeremy gave today has been welcomed by the CBI as it has been welcomed by the unions, because it focuses on the essentials. It focuses on what matters to people.
Well, the executive director says it doesn't go anywhere near far enough.
Well, look, if we're being criticised on the one hand for going too far, too close to the European Union, and on the other hand, we're being criticised for not going far enough.
But you, like Jeremy Corbyn, have been watching exactly how these negotiations...
You're interrupting me when I'm trying to answer your question.
But I'm trying to ask you exactly what this really means, which is that here is Europe saying, you know, OK, fine, you want to leave, you won't have a seat at the table, you won't have a veto, you won't have a vote, and yet you want to have a customs union. Well, how does that stack up?
Well, it stacks up very well because, as you know, there are three different things. One is the European Union, and if you are part of the European Union, you're not. You are bound by the acquis. You're bound by all the rules and the regulations that make up the single market.
But this whole vote is about sovereignty.
Again, you interrupt and fail to let me answer
all along, which are completely inconsistent.
Yes, but you don't let me answer any of them.
Sovereignty has been the whole issue about this thing, and you're suggesting that you're going to have a trading relationship with Europe in which we have no say, no veto, no vote.
Sorry, surely you cannot misunderstand it that badly. Okay, what Jeremy set out today, and your own piece made it clear, so it's clear from your own piece that you've just showed the viewer that actually what Jeremy said and what Keir said before that is that we would have to have a say in the agreements that we then made with third-party countries as part of that customs union. We wouldn't just be rule takers. Jeremy said it in his speech, and that's precisely why, before you interrupt me again and then ask another question, that's precisely why he said that within the single market, we could not be there because that would be being a rule taker. It would mean being subject to the four freedoms.
Okay.
It would mean actually accepting all the regulations.
Yes, but the whole point about this debate has been it's about sovereignty.
Without having...
And you're saying...
Without having a seat at the table.
Yeah.
And precisely
you might have a
Jeremy
seat at the table, but if you have no vote and no veto, and you're not a member of the European Union, you can't expect to be doing business with them on their terms without membership.
John, you are talking nonsense, and you must realise that, because the customs union is simply an agreement between states that says, vis-à-vis anybody else, we will apply the same tariffs and quotas. Vis-à-vis ourselves, we will have none. That's all it does. And therefore, when you're deciding what you do with those third-party countries, whether you will have tariffs and quotas with them, you do that jointly. And what we've said is, we want to do it jointly with the EU. That is where we would be, but the reason we would be there is because we want jobs, we want growth. That's why the CBI has welcomed this. That's why the unions have welcomed this, because they know, just as your businessman said on the piece that you showed, the paper man, he was the one who said, look, we've been asking for this for months. Now the Labour Party has gone and done it. They've said, this is how we would negotiate. The government is still flailing around without any clear objective and any clear
we must leave it there,
position.
but the clarity is what we'll all be searching for. Thank you very much for coming in.
Things you never thought you'd hear. Business lauding Jeremy Corbyn. Yes, suddenly the CBI can see merit in the man. Now he's firmly committed himself to backing a significantly softer form of Brexit. It's one measure of just how game-changing his move could be, potentially turning politics upside down. If that sounds like an exaggeration, let me be clear, it may turn out not to have any effect at all. It is all going to hinge on the next few weeks and whether Mr Corbyn can muster a majority in favour of his new pro-customs union stance. Now, if he can, the whole Brexit negotiation will change. But here's the thing, it is Tory rebels who now really decide whether we go for the softer Brexit or not. They have to decide whether to vote with Jeremy Corbyn or Theresa May. And they'll be less likely to go with Mr Corbyn if they think it'll make him Prime Minister. Well, we're in for some interesting times. Nick Watt was in Coventry to watch the Labour leader set out his new approach.
It is a British icon which has always had a special, if not always welcome place in Europe. And today, Jeremy Corbyn used the example of the modern Mini to illustrate the need for the UK to establish what he called a new, comprehensive customs union with the EU. The Mini, or at least parts of it, crosses the channel 3 times before it rolls off the production line. This highlights the need to maintain what Mr Corbyn described as a frictionless, interwoven supply chain.
We've long argued that a customs union is a viable option for the final deal. So Labour would seek to negotiate a new, comprehensive UK-EU customs union to ensure there are no tariffs with Europe and to help avoid any need whatsoever for a hard border in Northern Ireland.
A customs union with the EU would allow the UK to participate in core elements of the customs union. These are guaranteed tariff-free trade on goods with the EU, minimal customs checks with the EU, and levying the EU's common external tariff on goods from outside the EU. The Labour leader addressed the central reason why Theresa May is rejecting both a customs union and the customs union. That is the need for the UK to be able to negotiate its own trade deals beyond the EU. He would set as a condition for his proposed new customs union a definitive UK say in future EU trade deals.
A new customs arrangement would depend on Britain being able to negotiate agreement for new trade deals in our national interest. Labour would not countenance a deal that left Britain as a passive recipient of rules decided elsewhere by others that would mean ending up as a mere rule taker.
It was no mistake that Jeremy Corbyn chose Coventry, which voted leave. He wanted to show that he intends to abide by the letter and the spirit of Brexit by negotiating a bespoke relationship with the EU.
Today's speech was the culmination of painstaking negotiations within the shadow cabinet. Jeremy Corbyn has historically been wary of the EU, which he criticised today for embedding free market orthodoxy. But there are more enthusiastic supporters of the EU in the shadow cabinet, and they were delighted when the Labour leader also talked about forging a close relationship with the single market. I spoke to one ally of Jeremy Corbyn who said it's right that he's taken time to adapt his position. This person said to me, why let the Blairite agitators claim the credit for this? And also, why not let the Tories suffer a little longer on Brexit?
And of course,
one veteran Labour Eurosceptic welcomed Jeremy Corbyn's intervention in light of his pledge to shape future trade deals to help poorer countries.
Jeremy knows that this is a game changer for Europe, not for him, and he will set out this position and he will then show that here's somebody more sceptical than me about the European Union, who's tried his level best to get an agreement off them, and what have they done? They're going to, I would have thought, tell him to run and jump. But he will have shown the country that he was serious in trying to negotiate. And he'll get credit for that.
The icon of the left cited an icon of Britain's motoring history to inject new movement into the Brexit process. Theresa May will respond on Friday, but her fragile hold over Parliament means that the leader of the opposition may well have a role in shaping the outcome.
Nick Watt there. In a moment, we'll hear from one of Labour's front bench and a leading Tory. But first, Nick is with me now, and our business editor, Helen Thomas, to reflect on this. And I'm particularly interested in looking at whether Labour's support for the customs union membership means, A, it might happen, and B, what that means for the government, as it is possible to visualise some pretty dramatic consequences of all of this. So, Nick, let's go through this. How do MPs get to exert a vote on the customs union from this point?
Well, there's 3 ways in which a customs union could be put into law. In the first place, Jeremy Corbyn will table amendment to the trade bill calling for a customs union. Highly unlikely to see that going through, because I do not envisage Tory rebels voting for that. So the second option is this cross-party amendment that will be tabled by Anna Soubry for the Tories and Chuka Umunna for Labour. Now, we had a precedent in December where the Tory rebels did defeat the government, so that could go through. The other option is the separate EU withdrawal bill that is currently in the House of Lords. You will find that peers will try to amend that bill to put in a customs union, and the thing for the government is they would then have to get the numbers in the Commons to overturn that.
Right. Now, let's go through the maths here. There are 3 key numbers, which you're going to tell me. There's the government's working majority with the DUP. There's the number of Labour rebels who will support the government on Brexit, the Kate Hoeys, who add to that majority. And then you can calculate how many Tory rebels there need to be to make customs union happen. So let's go through those numbers.
Well, at the risk of trying to outbid you, Evan, of all people on numbers, those numbers are that the government's effective working majority with the help of the DUP in the House of Commons is 13.
1-3.
It's widely assumed that there are about 7 Labour Brexit rebels. In other words, they will vote down the line with the government on Brexit, which effectively then gives the government a majority of 27.
You have to double the 7 because otherwise...
Now, what that means is that you then need 14 Tory rebels to overturn that, although when the government was defeated in December on that Dominic Grieve amendment on a future vote, he managed to muster 12 Conservative MPs.
Right, so it's very finely balanced. Now, one of the techniques we've heard that the government may adopt is to say, hey, this isn't just, you're not just voting on customs union, you're voting on the future of the government, a confidence motion. And now, does that work?
Well, it's no to John Major in 1993. He was in trouble on the Maastricht Treaty, crucial vote, so what he did was he tacked a no-confidence motion onto that vote, and he saw it through. You cannot do that now, because the only no-confidence vote you can have is strictly prescribed by the Fixed Term Parliament Act, and the wording in that motion has to be that this House has no confidence in Her Majesty's government.
So you can't bundle it all together?
You can't do that. But what you could do is yes to John Major in 1995, when he challenged his party and said, back me or sack me.
I'll resign if you don't do what I say.
He resigned as Conservative leader. And you could see Theresa May saying to the Conservative rebels, thinking of backing perhaps the Soubry Amendment, watch out, you would enable Jeremy Corbyn. If you do that, I will trigger a contest.
Yeah. Wow, the politics is very interesting. Helen, I mean, actually, the politics is where a lot of the action's going to be for the next few months. But it was interesting to watch business coming out and sort of...
It was quite positive, really, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So the CBI welcomed this, called it a real-world solution. Aerospace and defence, you know, big industry body also welcomed this. It wasn't universal, actually. So British Chambers of Commerce basically dismissed this as all politics. And there was an acknowledgement, actually, that this sort of alliance of big business with the Labour Party was feeling a little odd. So the CBI had this warning about businesses have their eyes wide open on Labour's overall rhetoric on renationalisation. Remember, some of the things Labour's asking for here about clarifications to state aid, competition rules, privatisation and so on, reflect domestic policies that business isn't so keen on.
Cherry-picking from the EU, the bits that they think they wouldn't be allowed to do, but they'd like to. In terms of the practical differences now, we've sort of got customs union versus no customs union.
Well,
how big a deal?
So everybody says they want trade to be as frictionless as possible. It's a question of how you think you're going to achieve that and how realistic that plan is. Now, so the government wants to be able to strike its own trade deals, and it wants to rely on managed divergence, so more divergence in some areas than others, to stay as close as possible to the EU to allow it to get a favourable trade deal. Now, is that cherry-picking? Certainly the response from the EU seems to suggest that they think it might be. Is Labour cherry-picking too? We've got those changes they want to make to state aid rules and so on. Elsewhere, they talked about, you know, having a say in trade deals in the national interest, but they seem to be talking about having a say in future EU trade deals as part of some kind of bloc, not striking out on their own. When it comes to regulation, the Labour position's quite interesting. I spoke to one person tonight who said that they thought this at least left the door open to staying in the single market for goods only.
That's interesting.
So total alignment on rules and regulations for goods. That
sort of half in the single market for half the... Yeah.
And that, of course, basically solves your problem in Ireland. The hit is what happens to services, crucial to the UK economy and, of course, the city.
Nick, in 2 sentences, is it possible there are people in government who rather want the MPs to vote us into a customs union because they want to be in a customs union?
That is indeed the case. There are some Remain ministers who are hoping that Parliament will do the heavy lifting. I spoke to somebody not a million miles away from a Remain cabinet minister who says, we're hoping that Parliament will do our work for us.
Thank you both very much indeed. Well, we did ask the government if they wanted to come on tonight, but they weren't particularly interested. However, the two really important groups today are the Labour Party and the Tory rebels, and we have them both represented in the studio. We're joined by Barry Gardiner, the Shadow International Trade Secretary, and the Conservative MP, Sarah Wollaston. Very good evening to you both. I'm going to start with you, Barry Gardiner. Some think this is just politicking by the Labour Party, playing games in Parliament. Is it that, or is this a principled decision by the party?
No, look, I think Helen was absolutely right in singling out the words of the CBI and business. This decision has been taken because we think it is resolving the uncertainty that has been hanging over British business for the past 20 months. And people have been saying, look, we need to know what's happening with our supply chains. We need to know what is going to happen in terms of any tariffs or quotas that may arise between us and the other 27 countries. And what we're trying to do is really to bring some innovative thinking here and say, look, this is, if we were in government, and we're not, we accept that, we know we're not in government at the moment, but if we were, this is how we would want to conduct the negotiations.
But you know very well that may come to prevail, because there may be a vote in Parliament, and you indeed have asked for a vote.
It would provide two solutions, one to the issue that businesses face, and the other a good step towards solving the Irish problem.
Let's just push on there, because I'm really interested. If, let's suppose, you get the votes as you want in Parliament to insist on Britain staying in a customs union, is it your position that Theresa May can stay in government, stay as Prime Minister, to deliver the Brexit she says she doesn't want to deliver?
Evan, of course, I would love to see the government
Of course you would, because you're in opposition.
Of course.
But is it your position that you don't say she has to resign as a result of defeat on that vote?
Look, this is not in our gift, as you well know. We cannot force the sitting Prime Minister to resign. The only people that can do that, as I understand it, are the 1922 committee, or she herself could take that decision, or it would have to go to the vote that says, you know, it's a no confidence vote. Exactly.
So I just want to be clear. So if she loses that vote, because I think Tory rebels may be interested in this, if she loses the vote, are you going to say, we need an election, we need a confidence vote, get out of office, it's time for Jeremy Corbyn to become Prime Minister? Or will you say, there we are, now Theresa May, just carry on as you carry on most days?
Look, I think the real debate here will actually be in the Conservative Party.
Right. And but you're not going to call for it. Because, of course, the Tory rebels are not going to join you if they think this is about getting Jeremy Corbyn in number 10. But they will if it's about a customs union.
But that's why it's really important to understand that whatever we say the day after any vote does not actually change the facts on the ground, that this is not in our gift, it's in theirs.
Very interesting you're saying that, because that does sound to me like you're wooing Tory rebels by trying to say it's not about getting Theresa May out.
Let me say that the people that I'm interested in here are not the Tory rebels. It's actually the people out there who are in jobs that are dependent on these industries and that need to know that they're going to have jobs in 2 years' time, 3 years' time, and that's what the move that Jeremy's made today is going to facilitate.
Now, you said something really interesting in the first, and it's the phrase you've used all day, that this is a step towards solving the problem of the Irish border. It does not solve the Irish border problem, does it?
Absolutely.
However, Britain has committed to something that will solve the Irish border in the joint report that is being written up as a withdrawal agreement. And we have signed up to alignment of all relative regulation or relevant regulations that would, you know, be necessary for a border to be open. Are you signed up to that?
Look, I think there is a really difficult problem with the Irish border, and I think it's going to involve compromise on both sides, from us and from
it's all been agreed. We've signed. Britain has signed a joint report.
The government.
It's a withdrawal agreement. Are you saying you would renounce what they signed?
No, look. But don't try and bind us by what an incompetent Prime Minister has done.
Hang on.
To try and make sure that she can square the circle within her own cabinet.
But what are the Europeans going to think? Are they going to? Are you basically saying you don't stand by the agreement that was reached in December?
No,
OK. You are standing by it, or you are or you're not. I mean, you can't have it both ways.
Well, actually, I can dispute the premise of the question. Jeremy set out today Labour's position, and that is that we want to honour the Good Friday Agreement. We think it's absolutely fundamental that we have the border without infrastructure.
Everybody says all of this, but basically we've reached an agreement that says there will be alignment between the UK and the EU on product regulation if it's necessary for no border. And you are in agreement with that. You're not renouncing the agreement that Britain made in December. So, in effect, we are half in the single market as a result of it, aren't we?
And actually, we're not the government. We're not conducting these negotiations.
No, but it would be interesting. We'd love to know what you would do if you were. You're telling us some other bits of what you do.
Well, and I think what you've got to do is you've got to see how the whole political situation evolves, and with that we will try and always, as we've done today, keep one step ahead of the government, but do it in line with the principles that we set out in our manifesto, that we recognise the benefits of both the single market and the customs union.
You've been uncharacteristically sort of reticent about spelling it out, but we get the point. Barry Gardiner, thank you very much. Sarah Wollaston, now you are a supporter of a customs union of some kind.
That's right.
Why is that?
A customs union, even if that is a partial customs union, and it's about avoiding the serious unintended consequences of a no-deal, walk-away Brexit. It's not about trying to force the Theresa May to resign. Of course, I don't want to see that. But in some ways, I do think it may help her, because she will then be able to turn around to the 62 who are sort of threatening to sort of force her into a leadership contest. It will enable her to explain the reality. And the simple reality is this, that there isn't a parliamentary majority for a hard Brexit. And it allows her to go back to them, maybe say, you know, love to help.
I've done my best, guys.
I've done my best, exactly.
What can I do?
It is absolutely clear that the unintended consequences are very, very serious for business, the problem around Northern Ireland.
Just in your, on the parliamentary arithmetic, given a free vote, what would be the kind of the majority for a customs union, do you think?
Huge. Because we know there are very many ministers and many, many PPSs and other people who are currently not able to sign amendments, who would very much like to see us come to a customs arrangement of some sort. So I think this will help her.
What happens when Theresa May says, I'm treating this as a confidence issue? This is, the government stands or falls on this. Are you really going to walk through the lobby with Jeremy Corbyn?
But as we've heard, that's not practical, because the Fixed Term Parliament Act dictates that. And equally, the person who's actually, the people who are trying to force her into some kind of leadership challenge are the 62 who are on the other end of this, who actively
she might try to pull the wool. She might try to pull it anyway, mightn't she? She might say, look, formally there's no thing that forces, you know, a confidence vote, but I will resign, and there will be chaos if my party does not back me. But back me or sack me.
Why would she do that? Because the consequences would be terrible. So I don't believe that will happen.
So you wouldn't believe her if she said that?
No, I think it would be a very aggressive act. The right thing to do here would be to call those of us in who have very genuine concerns about this and talk to us about those concerns and see if we can find a way forward.
Why do you think she's given so much, actually since she became Prime Minister, to those 62, to what the ones who want the hard Brexit rather than soft Brexit, do you think?
Well, I don't know. I think that actually the parliamentary arithmetic is there, that we can't get away from that. There is no majority in Parliament or the Lords for a hard walk-away, no-deal Brexit. So there is going to have to be a compromise here that actually addresses the concerns, the inevitable fudge that we've had up to now around the Irish border. And that's also going to need to address things like regulatory alignment, because it's not just about the customs union. We have to look at all of this if we're going to
So how
resolve
is your
the issues.
position that we actually are going to have to align an awful lot of our product regulations with the EU in order to have no border?
Indeed.
Half in the single market.
And we have been told that there will be no sector-by-sector deals. I mean, the idea that there's going to be a sort of special arrangement to allow us to give state aid is for the birds, frankly. And equally...
So the countries... I mean, the Tory party has the most enormous adjustment to make in its expectations, if you're right, I mean, because they're talking about a very different game.
But the
one you're
alternative
talking
is
about.
that what we must do is explain to people what it means. So as chair of the Health and Social Care Committee, I've been listening to evidence around what the consequences would be just for pharmaceuticals, for example, if we have no regulatory alignment. You know, we're looking at the supply chains are extraordinarily complex for pharmaceuticals. So we're talking about, and even things like medical devices like dialysis tubing, which aren't manufactured in the UK. You know, we're looking at serious hold-ups at the border unless we have some...
Theresa May is going to give a big
reality.
speech on Friday, sort of setting out the government's position. We think we know quite a lot of it. If she offers some morsel on a customs agreement, not a customs union, but we will seek a customs agreement, will that do?
I don't mind whether we call it a customs agreement, a customs arrangement or a customs union. What it has to do is address whether or not we're going to see serious hold-ups at the border, and is it going to address the Northern Ireland issue, that we can't keep fudging. We need to have those issues addressed, or we need to explain to people genuinely what the consequences are. They could publish, for example, the economic impact analysis, and we need to have a serious discussion about what it means if we have a hard Brexit.
Sarah Wollaston, thank you very much. Barry Gardner, thank you both very much. Maybe you'll be voting together fairly soon.
So let's get the thoughts then of Kevin Maguire and Andrew Pearce. To Brexit we go, in fact, Jeremy Corbyn, and the showdown with Theresa May.
That's right, he was sent to Coventry to make his speech in a very modern, high-tech factory. He's now converted to the customs union, or a customs union. We'll have to see some of the detail, and it is this question now, with Tory rebels, Anna Soubry leading them, tabling an amendment to the trade bill. May's pushed it back until the month of May, because you know she's in trouble. Whether they will combine with the SNP and the Liberal Democrats and the Green and the Plaid Cymru and so on to actually defeat her. And it would be a catastrophic defeat for May. I think it's very hard to see how she could survive if she lost a vote like this. I don't think the government would fall, but Labour would have a vote of no confidence, I'm sure, and the Tories would have to get a new leader and a new Prime Minister, and I'm sure they would then soldier on, but it would be catastrophic. And this is why the FT's talking about this alliance. I just wonder, when the stakes are so high, whether those Tory rebels will put party before country, and what the politics rather than the principle of the position.
To go back a step, though, why has Jeremy Corbyn, or why has the Labour Party taken so long to firm up its position, and why have they decided on this?
Narrow party political gain, that's what it's all about. This is a man who spent his entire parliamentary career, Anna, in the division lobbies with Kate Hoey, voting against everything the EU did. He thinks it's a wretched, undemocratic organisation. For once, I'm with him on that, but this is a great opportunity. He's seen a moment, he's seen a potentially weak point for Theresa May. She has got rebels who say they may support the Soubry Amendment. I rather agree with Kevin. I think a lot of them will back off. There's a long way to go between now and May. They've delayed the vote because they couldn't probably win it right now. I think it's a very brave Tory MP votes to a position which could bring down the Prime Minister.
He's got here in a rather torturous route, it's got to be said, with Keir Starmer, the shadow Brexit secretary, doing a lot of the heavy lifting. He's got here because I think he's looked at the sums and he realises it'll be really bad for Britain if we're out the single market. You can turn Kent into a lorry park. The economy will suffer. There'll be lots of form filling in bureaucracy. You'll be paying taxes. It will hurt. But there's no doubt there's high economics and low politics, and the low politics is you see a chance to defeat May and cause mayhem for the Tories, which is why when they're rebels, push comes to shove, I just do wonder whether they will be there marching with him in step on the customs union.
A wonderful irony. Some of the people who are so pleased today in the Labour Party by what he's done are people like Chuka Umunna, Peter Mandelson, Lord Kinnock, all people who've called for Corbyn to go. They want him out. They want him out at all costs. So he's now the most unlikely bedfellows. The Eurosceptic Corbyn is now doing a deal which has thrilled people like Chuka Umunna. And the next thing now, they were already calling for it. We've seen the letter. It was on the front page of the Observer on Sunday. They now want him to go even further and say we'll stay in the single market, which means no end to free movement of people. He doesn't want any immigration anyway, Corbyn. He wants even more immigration because he thinks they'll all vote Labour.
Your politics can come from all sorts of different directions. You can still think being in the customs union is a good idea for Great Britain, the United Kingdom. You can think being in the single market is a great idea for Great Britain and the United Kingdom, particularly Northern Ireland. You can come from different politics and still think remaining, and remember, he campaigned for Remain, he voted for Remain. Yes, he's a Eurosceptic in many ways, but he sees, certainly saw, that Britain is better off in than out. So that's why he takes this position.
OK, but two questions then. One, why would the European Union buy this? It's got a slight whiff of had your cake and secondly, secondly, what would the implications be in terms of trade deals and the rest of the world if this was a policy that was adopted?
So Corbyn has decided that even though people voted to leave the European Union because they want to take power away from Brussels, he's giving power back to Brussels because he says we can't do deals and trade deals on our own. Poor Britain can't stand on its own 2 feet. We can only do trade deals if we're in the customs union, within the European Union, on their say-so, with their approval. But as we won't be in the European Union, we won't even be in any position to influence those trade deals in any shape or form. It's the worst of all worlds.
You're making the case for staying in.
The worst of all worlds. No, Kevin.
You're much better off
out completely.
You're much better off.
That's what people voted for. Out.
You're much better off being at the table.
Millions of Labour voters
and leading, not leaving. You'd be much better. You'd be much better there. But you're quite right that. If you stay in the customs union, you won't be able to negotiate deals outside. But are there any great deals to get outside? I often hear extremists like him talk about free trade deals. What? Do you really want to be eating chlorinated American chicken? The Americans coming in and taking over the NHS. The Chinese dumping cheap steel.
You
you really want that?
No, you don't.
And for instance, Trump, it is America first. It would be Britain second at best. It's a bit of a fantasy that there are all these great deals to be done around the world.
The whole of our trade policies are going to be predicated on the fact Kevin Maguire doesn't want to eat chlorinated.
I think it wasn't chlorinated chicken for you. It was all those mad cow pies you ate in your younger days. Finally got him going.
Can I ask a very quick question?
Yeah. Yes, you may.
It's your programme.
It's a bit random. When will this all be over?
Yes, can we get on with it?
I think midnight tonight. No, this is going to go on for decades.
Okay.
No, it's not.
You know it is.
No, it's not.
No.
We're leaving next year.
Because
next year.
There are going to be transitional periods.
And Corbyn and his lot are still trying to scuff the Brexit.
Let's move on. Move on time. It's going on for decades. We don't need to dwell any further.